I built a digital map case out of white oak and a 42-inch TV to display battle maps at the table. In this video, I'll walk through the entire project from start to finish and then wrap things up by showing you how to connect it to a laptop so that way you can display epic images, videos, and battle maps for a deeper level of immersion. If you're interested in doing this yourself, I documented the entire process in a series and put it in a playlist, which I'll link right here, that has over 90 minutes of build footage for you to learn from. The series covers multiple ways of doing each of the different steps depending on the skill level that you have and the availability to the tools that you might have, as well as the materials to use, measurements, and lessons learned along the way. I've also made the 3D model for the exact digital map case that I built in this video available over on Patreon, along with a full step-by-step instruction guide for you to follow along with and use to make your own. Just note this requires the use of the exact same TV that I bought, which is a Walmart branded TV that was super cheap on a Black Friday sale. My name's Brandon Moore, and it's time for MooreDnD.
Is it real or just a dream? It's time for MooreDnD. A world of danger mystery.
If you don't know what a digital map case is, it's essentially just a TV in a box that allows the TV to lay flat. The frame is typically made out of wood with some sort of mount to hold the TV into the frame, as well as a support for any unsupported part of the TV. I've actually built one of these before for myself, and after showing it off on the channel, a lot of you asked the same question. Can you show us how you built it? So this project started as a direct response to that request. I'm also lucky enough to have a workshop that has a bunch of fancy tools in it that can help me build something like this, but I know that's not the case for everyone. My goal with this was to build something that looks high-end, but to go over different ways of doing each step so that anyone of any skill level and tool availability could build one of their own. That's why the full instructional series exists, but this video is just going to be a broad overview of what I did. And one final note about this build is it's not staying with me. I already have a digital map case, I don't need a second one, so my plan with this was to give it to someone who could really use it. I'm hoping to give it away to someone local by maybe making a plan with a local game store to have an event to give it away, but I don't actually have a plan for that yet, so we'll figure that out in a future video. Because of this, however, I intentionally made this digital map case a little bit smaller than mine, just because I know not everyone has access to a big enough space like I do. And so that kicks off our list of materials. Starting with the TV, I went with a 42-inch OWN television, which is a Walmart branded television if you're unfamiliar, that I got on a Black Friday sale for about $89. It doesn't have much more in the way of features, but it is still an HD TV, so it has plenty of resolution for our purpose. After removing the TV from the box, the first step is to turn it on and make sure it isn't damaged. That would be a brutal way to start the project. The screen here was perfect, and honestly the color was much more vivid than I imagined it would be, so I was happy with the purchase. Now that the TV was confirmed functional, I had to start measuring. The measurements for the TV are on OWN's website and they're in the user manual, but I couldn't bring myself to just trust someone else's measurements. Turns out OWN does a pretty good job though, because the measurements that I got were exactly the same as the ones that they had listed. I needed all three of the dimensions, being the height, the width, and the depth, which would become the base measurements for the inside of our wooden frame. The lumber that I used was a slab of white oak that I got from my local lumber mill. It was surfaced on all four sides, so there wasn't anything special that I had to do with it other than cut it down to the correct dimensions. Or so I thought. We'll get back to that later. The first thing that I did to this lumber was use my miter saw to cut off about 12 inches from the end of the board. This gave me a fresh 90-degree cut to work with, and that end was pretty beat up and I didn't feel like fixing it later on. I did save this cutoff for a small hack that I learned to fix any imperfections in your project, which we'll go over later. Starting from the fresh cut that we now have on the board, I measured the length of the small side of the TV. We need two boards of this length that are 4 inches wide because that's the height of our digital map case. Luckily, my board here was about 8.5 inches wide, which meant that I would be able to get two boards out of one cut. Next, I needed to do the same thing, but for what would be the longer ends of our digital map case. These boards will also be 4 inches wide. However, their length will be the length of the TV plus twice the thickness of our boards, which are 3/4 of an inch. Or so I thought. Are you feeling that looming sense of a mistake ahead yet? I then headed over to the table saw to perform the remaining cuts to dimension our lumber, starting with the mounts that would hold the TV to the frame. I used a scrap sheet of 1/2-inch MDF that I had laying around that was about 16 inches wide, which was perfect because it would cover all 4 holes on the back of the TV. Now I just needed to cut it to length, which is the same length that we cut our short boards over on the miter saw. I took the easy way out and I used the short board that we cut over on the miter saw as a setup block for our table saw. And that's as simple as raising up the blade, putting the board in between the blade and the fence, and then slowly closing the fence until your board just touches the blade. Once it does, you know you're at the exact length that you need. From there, I turned the machine on and pushed the sheet through. Next, I split the boards that we cut on the miter saw. I set the gap to 4 inches, and then I raised the blade to cover the 3/4 inch thickness of the wood that we'd be cutting now. From here, I ran both the shorter board and the longer board through the saw, and then I flipped the cut off and ran them through again so that we had 2 4-inch boards of each length. The final cut that I made was for a support that I needed for the back of the TV that would support a part of the screen that sat up higher than where the TV mounted. For this, I used a scrap sheet of 3/4 inch plywood that I had lying around. I set the gap on the table saw now to 3 inches, which wasn't a specific measurement, but it was shallow enough to allow the board to support it without interfering with anything else we had already built. Then I ripped it the entire length and went back to the miter saw to cut it to length for the inside of the frame. While I unplugged my table saw here, you can see all the different pieces that we're left with after our cuts. The next thing that I did isn't something that's required for the build, but it makes it look far more epic. I decided to engrave the end of the digital map case with my logo. To do this, I first marked the center of one of the 2 shorter boards of the frame with a pencil. I then lined it up under the laser and centered the tool head with the mark. From there, it was as simple as picking the file that I wanted, adjusting the settings slightly, and hitting send. Then about 30 minutes later, I had a fully custom piece. Nice. Now I was at the point where I could finally get a good glimpse of what the project would look like. I lined up one of the long sides and both of the shorter sides, and then bumbled my way into getting the TV fitting within the frame. It was at this point I realized a crucial mistake that I made earlier on in the project. In most cases, when you buy lumber, reading that a board is 1 inch thick doesn't actually mean that the board is 1 inch thick. After it gets surfaced, dimensioning the lumber brings it down to about 3/4 of an inch. Well, it turns out that my local lumber mill is nothing if not honest, because when they said 1 inch, they meant it. Unfortunately, I just assumed, and so that meant that the extra thickness on the ends of the boards meant that the frame didn't line up right. It was annoying, it was my own fault, and it was time to get out the planer. This machine specializes in removing a small thickness of your material each time it passes through the machine. So I set it up, turned on the shop vac, and blew a breaker. As my heart began to shrink 3 sizes, I braved the cold weather and went outside to plug my vacuum into one of the outside outlets. I then flipped the breaker back on and began to take my frustration out on this white oak. I did eventually get it to near perfect, and boy did that do some good for the composure. And once I lined up those 3 frame pieces around the TV once again, it lined up as it should finally, which meant we could finally get back to our regularly scheduled program. Now, the reason I hadn't lined up the 4th board yet was because the sensor for the remote sits on the bottom of the TV and sticks out slightly, which means it would get in the way if we tried to put that 4th board up against the TV. I measured where exactly the sensor was, getting the distance from each side of the TV, measuring the thickness of the sensor, and getting the depth from the front of the TV to the back. Once I had those measurements, I removed the TV so that way we could start assembling the frame, after which I would chisel out enough space for that sensor to fit into it. I prepared a couple 36-inch bar clamps that I have to tightly compress the frame after I add the glue to hold it tightly together. I then kicked off this process by adding wood glue to the parts of the frame that would be joining together, using a silicone brush to spread the wood glue. After applying the glue, I lined up the boards and torqued the bar clamps into place. The wood glue does end up everywhere, so you definitely want to try to wipe up as much as you can while it's still drying. Wood glue is water soluble, so it's as simple as grabbing a paper towel, wetting it, and wiping down your piece. Any glue remaining on your project won't hurt the project, but it will hurt the finish that you put on it because many finishes won't adhere to dried glue. Now, the glue would typically be enough, but I knew that this map case would likely be moved around often, so I wanted to add an extra source of strength to the joints. I opted for 2-inch long 18-gauge brad nails, which I set into the wood while the glue was drying. I added 2 to each corner, 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom, but my hose unfortunately had a small air leak in it, so a few of the brad nails didn't go that deep into the wood. To fix this, I used what's called a nail punch or an awl punch, as I learned from this commenter right here. I appreciate it, buddy. And set the nails deep enough into the wood to leave a fillable hole. Once the glue finished drying, I started to measure out the part of the frame I would need to remove for the sensor. I began by measuring the appropriate distance from the inside of the frame to where the sensor sits and marking that with a line. Next, I marked the thickness of the sensor using a T-square. Then finally, I measured roughly 2 inches down from the top of the digital map case because this is how far down the TV sensor goes. And once I had all the lines, it was finally time to start chiseling away. And unfortunately, you won't see that because I am self-admittedly one of the worst people with the chisel in his hand of all time. I have terrible technique. It took me so long to do this, and I ended up giving up about 3/4 of the way through with the chisel and switching to a hand router, which probably took me more time to set up than it would have taken to chisel it away appropriately. I refuse to show you all a technique that I know is absolutely incorrect, so instead I'll refer you to this super cool video I found on the proper way to use a chisel. Once I managed to finally make a space for this sensor, it was time to give this piece its first good sanding. I used 100 grit sandpaper and went over the entire outside of the frame with an orbital sander. I didn't want to take off too much of the top of the frame because that could lead to uneven surfaces, so I switched to the sanding mouse for this part to do it manually. And by the way, a sanding mouse is just a hand sander that uses the same round sandpaper that an orbital sander would. Now I needed to fill in the holes that I made with the brad nailer. I also spotted some gaps and cracks in the piece while I was sanding, so I fixed those too. I used a method I learned a while back to essentially create your own wood putty that matches the color of the wood you're using for your project using the sawdust that comes off of the wood. It's as simple as taking sawdust that comes off your piece and mixing it with wood glue, which we know hardens with your wood, to get a wood putty that closely resembles the color of your project. So the first thing I needed was sawdust, and unfortunately the sanding that I just didn't produce enough sawdust for me to use. That's okay though. Remember that cutoff piece we saved earlier? I grabbed that and started sanding it with some 60 grit coarse sandpaper. After collecting the sawdust, I mixed in an unmeasured amount of wood glue, which I had a beautiful B-roll shot of on my phone if I just would have hit record. This part is just feeling out a good consistency, but the best thing I can say to shoot for is a gritty sugar cookie dough. Once it was mixed, I just plastered it all over the areas that had voids to be filled. Try to do this quickly because the glue hardens much faster in this mixture and your putty will start to dry out. This doesn't need to be pretty because you're going to sand it when you're done anyway, which you can see me doing here. Now I won't say that the plugs are invisible, but it's far better than the holes you would have had all over the piece in the first place. Now there are two types of people in this world, those who love roundovers and those who love chamfers. I myself am a big fan of the chamfer, and I actually forgot to include this part of the video in the original instructional series, so you get to see something that hasn't been seen before. The chamfer is a flat corner that's typically a 45-degree angle. That's the route I went, and to do so was as simple as grabbing the 45-degree flush trim bit, adding it to the hand router, and running it across the top of our piece. Of course, this part is not required for your digital map case build, but it does add a beautiful finish to the top that gives it that nice, clean look. Once that was finished and the frame was set, it was finally time to dry fit the frame around our television. It took a bit of maneuvering to get it to fit around the screen the first time because I had a bunch of that plastic sheeting that protects the screen bunched up in some of the corners, but eventually the frame fell perfectly into place. This meant it was time to move on to the mounting piece and the support. I started by putting all of the mounting bolts into the TV and getting them roughly the same height. This is how I marked on the mounting board where I needed to drill holes for the bolts to go through. To do this, I added a small amount of yellow acrylic paint to the top of each of the bolts. Then I grabbed the mount, put it into place, and slowly lowered it down on top of the bolts, pressing down on each one to make sure that it touched the paint. As I lifted up, you can see the yellow paint transferred to the mount, marking exactly where I need to drill the holes. Since these are M6 size bolts, I needed to drill holes using a 1/4 inch drill bit. So I loaded it into the drill, placed it on top of the markings, and began to drill the holes. Before I could put the mount in, however, I needed to affix the support first, because once the mount is in, it would be impossible for me to slide the support underneath. Using a pocket hole jig, I created pocket holes on each end of the support, and while I was at it, I added pocket holes to the top and bottom of the mount as well. This is because for the mount to secure your TV to the frame, the mount itself has to be affixed to the frame. I then added glue to each end of the support and dropped it into place, making sure the pocket holes were facing up and accessible. Following the support, it was now time to add the mount. Having already removed the bolts, I placed the mount into place, lining up the holes. I then hand tightened the bolts through the mount into the TV, and then followed that up with a ratchet and a 10mm socket. Once the mount was in place, I grabbed a few more construction screws and secured the mount to the frame. And as bad as I wanted to flip this project over and see what it looked like, I wanted to add the rubber feet on the bottom first. These rubber feet are not only important for protecting the surface that you're playing on and preventing the screen from shifting around, but they also lift the digital map case up enough to allow heat that's produced from the TV to escape, preventing your TV from overheating. I added 1 foot to each corner of the frame, and then I added 1 more in the middle of each of the long ends. Finally, it was time to flip this thing over, and I must say, it did not disappoint. The color looked great, the TV fit perfect, and the wood looked fantastic. I also couldn't wait any longer to pull off that plastic sheeting, and sheesh, did she look purty. Now, I could have stopped here, but I wanted to add a nice layer of protection to the wood. So that meant this moment of awe was short-lived. I flipped the digital map case back over and removed the frame from the TV, which was as simple at this point as removing the 4 bolts from the back. I also took off the 6 rubber feet because I knew I'd be spraying the whole project with a few coats of polyurethane, and while that wouldn't hurt the rubber feet, there's no reason to do it to them if I don't have to. I carefully set the TV aside and began to prep the area for the finishing coats. This meant protecting my assembly table and my table saw with a drop cloth that you would use for painting. I originally had some plastic sheeting, but it unfortunately wasn't long enough to protect the saw, so I had to switch to the drop cloth. After grabbing all of my supplies, I flipped the case on end and used my sanding mouse to do one final sanding of the project using a 320 grit fine sandpaper. I did this part by hand so that I could sand with the grain and get rid of any cross marks that might have been created when I used the orbital sander before. After sanding, I needed to remove the dust before spraying on a finishing material, so I started off with the vacuum. Blowing it off with an air compressor is usually faster and easier, but it also forces dust into the pores of your project, so I opted for slow and steady. I also unintentionally flipped all of you off here, so I made sure to blur that out for our younger audience. As an additional step, I also used something called a tack cloth to lift any remaining sawdust from the project. This cloth is made specifically for this purpose as it's got a very sticky or tacky property, allowing you to lift any of that sawdust up without leaving behind any residue. Now, once this was done, the only thing left to do was to lift the project off of the surface slightly so that way after you spray it, it doesn't adhere to the surface. Lifting it also allows air to flow around the project, reducing your dry time. From there, I opened the garage door and began to apply a light, even coat of polyurethane all around the visible parts of the frame. I didn't record every layer, but I did this a total of 3 times. That was the last thing I did in the instructional series because I had to wait a good bit of time for the polyurethane to cure. Once it did, I brought it down here, laid my TV flat on my game table, and started to assemble once again. As before, I tightened all 4 of the bolts into the back of the mount. I then added the 6 rubber feet to the frame, and from there, I also made sure to add my HDMI cable now, so when I flip it, I'm able to attach it to my laptop. Look at this thing shine before I even turned it on. Now, before I show you what I do to get my battle maps on there, let's get a good look at the finished product. It looks so good, and I cannot wait to give it to someone, but let's look at how we can hook this thing up to a laptop to get it displaying what you want. The first thing you're going to need is whatever kind of cord you're using to hook up to your laptop. These days, that could be something like a USB-C. I still use an HDMI cord, and that's what this TV had accessible. Once I run the HDMI cord to my laptop, then we figure out what program we want to use to display the maps. In the past, I used Owlbear Rodeo, which is a great free option. You can use the full program totally free. The only exception is storage space. As you begin to add more maps down the road, you may run out of space, and you just have to pay to have more space. Roll20 is another great free option, and it also integrates with a lot of TTRPG material. The only downside is that sometimes this TTRPG material is not free. That part you have to pay for. But if you just need the basics, Roll20 is great as well. What I use now is Foundry, and Foundry is not a free option, and they don't have a free option. It is, however, a one-time payment instead of a monthly subscription, which is what ultimately led me to go that route. There are many other VTTs, and no matter which one you're using, they all act pretty much the same here. The first thing you do is you upload the map to the VT, creating some sort of scene. From there, you open the scene on your laptop as the DM, getting the DM view. Now, to display that map as a player view on the other screen, you need to open up another web browser. Keep in mind here, you may actually need to open up an incognito browser because if you open up another regular one, when you load up your VTT, it may recognize that you're the DM and give another DM view. In incognito mode, it doesn't recognize who's opening the web browser, and so you need to sign in again. And this is where you would paste some form of link for the player view. Once you've got that web browser open, slide it over to the other screen, and here's a quick tip. If you want to make it full screen without any top or bottom framing to the web browser, simply click F11. That maximizes your screen and gets rid of everything. Another quick tip, while you have the window maximized, if at any point you have a problem with the window where it doesn't refresh, you can refresh it without minimizing by hitting F5. And finally, the last thing to do on the player side on your digital map case is to zoom in or out until the grid matches the size of your miniatures. From there, everything else is controlled by your laptop on the DM side of things, unless of course you need to move the map around as your players move through the dungeon. And that is everything on how I built this digital map case, and I cannot wait to give it away. So if you're looking forward to that, make sure you subscribe so that way you can see that video when it comes out. Also, don't forget, I have the full build plan with instructions for this exact digital map case that I built over on my Patreon, which is just at MooreDnD. As always, I appreciate you watching. Thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next video.